He built an empire on fear and destroyed his family with a single signature. Vincent DeLuca divorced his pregnant wife on a Tuesday morning, handed her nothing, and married someone else before the ink was dry. For 7 years, he told himself it was business. For 7 years, he was wrong. Now 2 children he never held are standing inside his mansion, and what they left on his wall will cost him everything he thought he owned. If this story already has you gripped, hit like right now, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and stay with me until the very last word. You are not going to want to miss what happens next. The portrait had hung above the fireplace in the main hall of the DeLuca estate for 11 years. Oil on canvas, 6 feet wide, commissioned from a Florentine painter who charged $40,000 and needed 3 sittings to get the light right on Vincent's jaw. The frame was gilded, the background a deep burgundy that matched the drapes flanking the double staircase. And the composition was deliberate. Vincent at the center, one hand resting on a dark mahogany table, shoulders squared, eyes cold and direct in the way his father had taught him eyes should look when people needed to fear you. Behind him, slightly to the left, Victoria in a champagne gown, her posture immaculate, her smile the kind of smile that costs something to maintain. She looked like a woman who had never once been surprised by anything unpleasant. The portrait said, "This family has always been exactly this." At 6:17 on a Thursday morning, Vincent DeLuca stood at the foot of the staircase with a coffee cup he had not yet raised to his mouth and stared at the wall above the fireplace and understood, in the particular silent way that real shock works, that the portrait was gone. What hung in its place was not a painting in the traditional sense. It was a mural, worked directly onto the plaster beneath the canvas, which meant whoever had done this had planned it in advance, had known the portrait would come down, had prepared for what would be exposed underneath. The image was large, precise, and devastating in its composition. A woman standing at the edge of what appeared to be a wide window overlooking a city at night, her back turned to the viewer, her arms loose at her sides, the line of her shoulders holding something between exhaustion and dignity that was impossible to look at without feeling the weight of it. Around her, rendered in soft ochre and deep charcoal, were fragments: a child's shoe, a torn letter, a key on a plain ring, a hospital bracelet, arranged not chaotically, but with the kind of patient intention that takes hours, maybe days. At the bottom of the mural, in capital letters painted in a clean, unembellished hand, "Mother never forgot." Vincent stood there for a full 90 seconds. He did not call out. He did not move. He was aware of the sound of the house, the distant hiss of the kitchen espresso machine, the muted tick of the grandfather clock in the study down the hall, the particular silence of a large home where the people inside it are still sleeping. And he was aware, in some precise animal register beneath conscious thought, that something had shifted permanently. He set the coffee cup on the side table without looking at it. His head of household security, a compact Slovak named Miroslav, who had worked for the DeLuca family for 9 years and who spoke rarely and never about anything unnecessary, appeared at the far end of the hall at 6:22. He had been awake since 4. He had reviewed the camera footage twice before bringing it to Vincent. He held a tablet in one hand and stood 3 feet from his employer and waited. "Show me," Vincent said. Miroslav handed him the tablet. The footage was from the internal camera system. Every entrance, every corridor, the main hall itself. The timestamp ran from 11:47 p.m. to approximately 3:09 a.m. For most of that duration, the footage showed exactly what it should. Empty hallways, unchanged rooms, the portrait hanging exactly where it had always hung. At 3:09, a 12-second loop repeated. Then at 3:10, the portrait was gone and the mural was there. "How?" Vincent said. "Someone accessed the server room," Miroslav said. "Replaced 11 minutes of footage with the loop, then cleaned the server room on the way out. No prints." Vincent looked at the mural again. "This took more than 11 minutes." "Yes," Miroslav said. "Considerably more." "Which means the footage starts wrong. Before 11:47. Before the system was compromised." "Yes." Vincent placed the tablet down on the side table next to the coffee cup. He looked at the mural for another moment. Then he said, "Who else is awake in this house?" "Mrs. DeLuca's sweet light came on at 6:10. Her assistant arrived at 6:15. The kitchen staff since 5. "Don't tell her yet." Miroslav nodded once and withdrew. Vincent stood alone in the hall. He was 41 years old. He was 6'1" and had not lost the physical weight of a man who had spent his 20s doing things with his hands that people in his current tax bracket paid others to do. His hair was dark, starting to silver at the temples, kept short in a way that was more utilitarian than stylish. His face was the face of a man who had long ago decided that expression was a vulnerability, and who had built something so close to blankness across his features that most people in his professional life read it as menace. They were not entirely wrong. He was also standing in his own entrance hall at 6:20-something on a Thursday morning, completely undone. He had not heard Evelyn's name spoken aloud in this house in 7 years. He had, in the particular way that men like him manage inconvenient history, simply ceased to acknowledge that the history existed. The lawyers had been thorough. The settlements had been sealed. The staff who had known her had been rotated out within the first 18 months, replaced with people who knew nothing about a woman named Evelyn Carter, who knew nothing about a marriage that had ended on a Tuesday morning in February with Vincent sitting across a mahogany desk from his own attorney and signing his name 7 times while the woman he was divorcing sat in a different room in a different building and signed her name 3 times because she was past arguing about any of it. He hadn't known she was pregnant when he signed. That was what he had told himself in the years since. That was the story that allowed him to sleep, more or less, without the specific weight of that particular fact crushing the air from his chest at 3 in the morning. He hadn't known. Except the mural on the wall of his entrance hall said, "Mother never forgot." And the woman who had painted it, or arranged for it to be painted, had known things about the interior of his security system that his own team had not anticipated, which meant she had resources and patience and a very specific kind of long-term thinking that, standing in his entrance hall, Vincent DeLuca recognized because he had once loved a woman who was exactly like that. He went to his study. He called his attorney. He said, "Get me everything you can find on Evelyn Carter, current as of today. Not the old files. Current. Business, address, travel, everything." He ended the call before the attorney finished saying yes. Then he sat behind his desk and looked at his hands and did not move for 11 minutes. The house that Evelyn Carter had grown up in was a rental unit above a dry cleaner in Queens, and the summers had smelled like solvent and steam and the particular kind of heat that builds in a room without cross-ventilation until the air itself feels hostile. Her mother had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and had been beautiful in the exhausted way that women who are too busy to maintain beauty sometimes are, something bright and stubborn in the eyes, something that the tiredness could not quite reach. Evelyn had inherited the eyes. She had inherited other things too, less comfortable ones. A precision about other people's motivations that sometimes read as coldness, a patience that could easily be mistaken for passivity by people who did not understand the difference between waiting and giving up. She had met Vincent DeLuca at 26 at a fundraising dinner that she had attended in her capacity as a junior events coordinator for a mid-size Manhattan hospitality firm. He had been 32, recently promoted to the public face of the DeLuca Group's legitimate business interests, and he had walked into the room with the contained energy of a man who was accustomed to every space rearranging itself around his presence. Evelyn had noticed this and had deliberately sat with her back to the entrance so she wouldn't have to watch it happen. He had found her anyway. He had a talent for that. She had not been swept off her feet in any cinematic sense. She had been cautious and specific in her affections, had taken 14 months to agree to move in with him, had kept her own accounts and her own professional identity with a deliberateness that his family found inexplicable and that Vincent himself had initially found challenging and then, over time, had come to understand was one of the truest things about her. She didn't need him. She chose him. There was a difference, and it mattered. They had been married for 3 years when the family pressure reached a threshold that Vincent's capacity for resistance could not hold against. The DeLuca family's Italian-American heritage was not incidental to their identity. It was structural, load-bearing, and it carried with it a specific weight of expectation about alliances, about blood, about what a DeLuca marriage meant in the context of the family's business relationships. Vincent's father, Marco DeLuca, was a man of 70 who had built the family's empire across 4 decades, and who spoke about legacy the way other men spoke about heir, as though its necessity were too obvious to explain. Marco had made his position clear in the understated, absolute way of men who do not need to raise their voices. The family needed an alliance that would strengthen their position with the Ashcroft network, which was old money, politically connected, and currently represented by a 28-year-old named Victoria, who had grown up understanding exactly what she was being groomed for. Vincent had resisted for 8 months. In the 9th month, he had capitulated. He had not told Evelyn about the family's position until the morning he asked her to sign the divorce papers. He had not given her time to respond or argue. He had sat across from her in the apartment they shared, with the morning light coming through the windows they had picked out together, and he had said, "I need you to understand that this is not about what I want." And Evelyn had looked at him for a long, specific moment and then had said very quietly, "Then what is it about, Vincent?" And he had not answered because the honest answer was that it was about fear, and he had not yet developed the vocabulary for that particular admission. She had signed the papers in a different building, in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and fluorescent lights. She had not cried in front of anyone. She had come home to the apartment they had shared, which was technically in her name, which was the one thing she had insisted on 3 years earlier for no reason she could have articulated at the time. And she had sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. And then she had called her obstetrician and confirmed the appointment she had made the previous week, and she had hung up the phone, and she had made the particular decision that would define the next 7 years of her life. She was keeping them. She was keeping both of them. She was leaving New York, and she was not going to tell Vincent DeLuca that he was about to become a father, because the man who had sat across from her that morning and cited family and legacy while avoiding her eyes had forfeited the right to that information. That was not bitterness. That was clarity. Well, 7 years later, Evelyn Carter, she had never taken his name, and the Carter had always been hers, sat in the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight from Geneva to New York and worked through the final details of the Foundation's spring gala on her laptop. She was 37. She wore a dark blazer over a cream blouse, and her hair was pulled back with the kind of casual precision that took practice to make look effortless. Across the aisle, her assistant, a young Korean-American woman named Priya, who was extraordinarily competent and had never once made Evelyn feel like she needed to slow down, was reviewing venue contracts on her own screen. In the row behind them, separated by a curtain and a great deal of deliberate parental organization, Charlotte and Ethan were not arguing about the window seat in any way that was technically audible. They were 6 years and 10 months old. They would be 7 in 6 weeks. Charlotte had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, though Evelyn had never said the latter out loud. Ethan had his father's height already. He was running several inches ahead of the pediatric charts, and a stillness to him that was his own, that Evelyn could not trace to either parent. They were extraordinary children in the particular way that is not about precocity or performance, but about weight, about a quality of attention that made adults in their vicinity feel slightly observed. They also had, both of them, an idea. Evelyn had not known about the idea for several weeks. When she found out, she had sat Charlotte and Ethan down at the kitchen table of the Geneva apartment and asked them to explain from the beginning how exactly they had planned to execute the mural installation inside the DeLuca estate's main hall. Charlotte had explained. Ethan had added the relevant technical detail about the security system, which he had researched with the methodical patience of a child who had understood very early that most adults underestimate children who stay quiet. Evelyn had listened to the full explanation without interrupting. Then she had asked, "Did you plan this without telling me?" Charlotte had said, "We knew you would say no." Ethan had said, "We weren't asking for permission. We were informing you after." Evelyn had looked at both of them for a long moment and had understood, with a complicated combination of pride and a kind of vertigo, that she had raised her children too well for her own peace of mind. She had not said no. What she had done instead was spend 4 days thinking through the implications, and then she had called a man named David Holt, who was a retired security consultant with whom she had worked 3 years earlier on the Foundation's digital infrastructure, and she had said, "I need to know if what my children are planning is theoretically executable without anyone being harmed." And David had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Theoretically." She had said, "Exclusively theoretically." He had said, "I'd want to see the floor plan." The floor plan, it emerged, was something Ethan had already acquired through a combination of publicly filed architectural permits, an online database of estate records, and one piece of information that Evelyn decided she did not need to ask the origin of. They had not done it to hurt him. This was the thing that Evelyn had understood about her children from the very beginning of the idea, once they explained it to her. They did not hate Vincent DeLuca. They did not know him well enough to hate him, and they were too clear-eyed to hate someone they had never met. What they wanted was acknowledgement. What they wanted, in the particular unadorned way of children who have grown up around honesty, was for the man who had erased their mother to understand that she had existed, that she still existed, that she had never once forgotten what had been done to her, and had built a life of such self-sufficiency and quality that the forgetting was, in retrospect, his loss and his alone. The mural was not a threat, it was a statement. It was also, and this was the part that Evelyn spent the most time with during 4 days of careful consideration, an opening. Vincent DeLuca's attorney, a second-generation Italian-American named Gerald Russo, who had worked for the DeLuca family for 20 years and who combined genuine legal expertise with a thoroughness that sometimes crossed into anxiety, delivered his report by encrypted file transfer at 4 p.m. on Thursday. Vincent read it at his desk with the door locked and the light failing outside the window. Evelyn Carter, née Carter, had founded the Carter Global Foundation for Hospitality and Cultural Exchange in the year following their divorce. The foundation was real. Board-certified, fully transparent financials, a permanent office in Geneva, a second office in Singapore, an annual gala that drew legitimate players from the European diplomatic circuit and the Southeast Asian business community. The foundation's primary focus was on vocational training in the hospitality sector in underserved regions, and it had distributed over $40 million in grants in the past 5 years. Evelyn served as CEO and sat on 3 additional nonprofit boards. She was recognized in the Swiss business press. She had given 2 keynote addresses at international development conferences. She was, by every measurable indicator, exactly what she had always been in potential when Vincent had married her. Formidably capable and entirely uninterested in being anyone's supporting character. She also had 2 children. Charlotte Evelyn Carter, aged 6 years 10 months. Ethan Marco Carter. Ethan Marco, Vincent noted, which was a thing that sat in his chest like a stone because Marco was his father's name, and he did not know what to do with the information that Evelyn had given his father's name to a child she had raised alone. Aged 6 years 10 months. Twins. Born 8 months after the divorce was finalized. Vincent sat with this information for a long time. He had not known she was pregnant. He told himself this again, in the study, at his locked desk, with the late afternoon light going gray outside. He had not known, but he had also not asked. On the morning he had told her he was filing for divorce, he had not once looked at her face long enough to see what was there. He had looked at the table. He had looked at his own hands. He had looked at the door when he left. He had not looked at her because looking at her would have required him to actually see her, and seeing her would have made it impossible to do what he had already decided to do. And what he had decided to do was the thing his father needed him to do and his family needed him to do. And the one thing, the single thing in his life up to that point, that he had not been capable of refusing. That, too, was not something he had allowed himself to articulate before now. He opened the encrypted file to the final section. Current travel records, cross-referenced from passport databases through channels that Gerald kept deliberately ambiguous. Evelyn Carter had departed Geneva 3 days ago. Her destination, New York. She was already here. He did not tell Victoria about the mural for 36 hours, which told him something about the state of their marriage that he filed away without looking at directly. Victoria Ashcroft. DeLuca found out at 7 p.m. on Friday when she came downstairs before a dinner engagement and stood in the main hall and looked at the wall where her portrait had been and was not. She turned and looked at Dominique, her personal assistant, who was standing 4 feet behind her and who had known since that morning and had been instructed by Miroslav not to bring it up. "What," Victoria said, "is that?" Dominique said nothing, which was the right answer. Victoria looked at the mural for a long moment. She was 35, blonde, with the kind of polished presentation that was not accidental and did not come cheap. She had married Vincent DeLuca at 28 with a precise understanding of what the marriage was and was not, and she had maintained that understanding with a discipline that she considered privately one of her genuine accomplishments. She was not naive. She was not happy. These were not, in her mind, contradictions that required resolution. She read the words at the bottom of the mural. She read them again. Then she walked to the parlor, poured herself 3 fingers of scotch she did not usually drink, sat in the chair by the window, and did not speak for 45 minutes. When Vincent came home at 8:15 from what had been, nominally, a business dinner, and was in fact 4 hours of sitting in his car in a parking structure in Midtown trying to think clearly about a situation that resisted clear thinking, he found her there. "You should have told me," Victoria said. She did not say it with anger. She said it with something closer to exhaustion. "Yes," Vincent said. He sat down across from her. "How many children?" she said. "2," he said. "Twins." Victoria looked at her glass. She did this. "Her children did it," Vincent said, "based on everything I can determine." Something moved across Victoria's face that was not quite readable. Then she said, "How old?" "Almost 7. The room held both of them for a moment. "You didn't know," Victoria said. It was not a question. She had been with him long enough to know what he looked like when he carried something, and he had not been carrying this. Whatever he was carrying now was new. It was fresh, and it was devastating, and it was going to change everything. And Victoria Ashcroft DeLuca, who had built her life on the discipline of knowing exactly what she had, understood in the parlor of a house that had never quite felt like hers, that the version of her life she had been managing was about to require significant renegotiation. "No," Vincent said. "I didn't know." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the city made its city sounds. Inside, the mural was in the entrance hall, and the coffee cup was still on the side table where Vincent had left it that morning, and the portrait that had hung above the fireplace for 11 years was in a storage room in the basement, face down against a wall, and nothing in the house was where it had been 24 hours ago. The Carter Global Foundation Spring Gala was held at a hotel in Midtown that had been thoroughly renovated 3 years prior by a firm that Evelyn had personally consulted on the project. The ballroom ceiling had been raised, the lighting redesigned from the fixtures outward, the acoustic engineering redone to allow conversation at normal register even at full occupancy. It held 400 people comfortably, and on the night of the gala it held 412, which was a number Evelyn knew precisely because she had reviewed the final head count with the venue coordinator at 5 p.m. She arrived at 6:45. She wore a gown the color of deep water. Not quite blue, not quite green, the kind of color that photographs differently than it looks in person. And her hair was down, which it rarely was in professional settings. She moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who has organized enough events to understand that the host's job is not to perform enjoyment, but to create the conditions in which it's possible for others. Priya was at her elbow, efficient and nearly invisible. "Table 7 RSVP confirmed as of this afternoon," she said quietly. "He's coming," Evelyn said. It was not a question. Gerald Russo's office confirmed on his behalf. Evelyn nodded and continued moving through the room. She had sent the invitation 8 days after the mural installation. Not to Vincent directly, she had sent it through the Foundation's standard distribution list, which had, through a chain of connections that was entirely legitimate and entirely deliberate, landed in Gerald Russo's inbox with a handwritten note from Evelyn on the Foundation letterhead that said simply, "We would be honored to have the DeLuca Group represented at this year's gala." No other message. No reference to the mural, to the children, to any of it. Just the formal note and the invitation, which Gerald had brought to Vincent the same afternoon with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided this was not a situation he was going to have an opinion about. Vincent had attended events he wanted to avoid before. He was good at it. He sat at his table, he said the right things to the right people. He ate the food and drank moderately and left at a time that was polite without being early. He had done it dozens of times at dozens of events with a professionalism that most people in his circle mistook for ease. He arrived at the gala at 7:20 and understood immediately, in the way the body understands things before the mind articulates them, that this was not an event he was going to manage. The room was too well organized. The people were too legitimate. He recognized 2 senators, a deputy secretary of something from the State Department, the chairman of a private equity firm whose legitimacy was beyond question. And standing at the center of all of it, talking to a silver-haired man who appeared to be Swedish and very pleased to be there, was Evelyn. He had not seen her in 7 years. The mind does something specific when it sees a person it once knew intimately after a long absence. It layers, it compares, It runs the present image against the stored archive in a way that is involuntary and occasionally merciless. He stood near the entrance and looked at her across the room, and the layering happened, and what he came out with on the other side of it was this. She was more than she had been. Not different. More. There was a quality to the way she occupied the room that had nothing to do with the gown or the hair or any surface element. It was something in the distribution of weight, in the specific manner of her attention, in the way she held herself in her own life as though it fit her exactly. He had not given her that. She had built that after he left. With his children, who he had not known existed, in a city he did not know she was in. He crossed the room. It took him 4 minutes because there were people to acknowledge and hands to shake, and it was that kind of room. But his navigation through it was not social. It was direct, with the social performance overlaid like a skin on top of the actual direction of travel. When he reached her, the Swedish man had moved on. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, and she looked at him and did not change her expression in any direction. No warmth, no hostility, no performance. "Vincent," she said. "Evelyn." He could hear how his own voice sounded and did not fully approve of it. Too careful. Too much control applied to it, which made the control visible. They stood for a moment. 400+ people in the room, and the noise of it was everywhere, and in the immediate space around them, it was as though someone had turned a dial. "Thank you for coming," she said. She meant it in the formal sense. It was a complete sentence that also communicated that she was not going to pretend this was a coincidence. "You could have called," he said. "I could have," she said. "I chose not to." He looked at her. "The mural. My children made a choice," she said. "I supported it." He had prepared for this conversation in the way he prepared for difficult business conversations, by thinking through the possible trajectories, identifying the variables, deciding where he was willing to move and where he was not. None of the preparation was available to him now. He was standing in front of a woman he had divorced while she was carrying his children, and the preparation had the structural integrity of paper and rain. "Where are they?" he said. She studied him for a moment. Whatever she was looking for, he didn't know if she found it. "Downstairs," she said. "There's a private room off the east corridor. Priya will show you." She turned back to the room. He stood for a moment, looking at her profile, and then he followed the young woman who had appeared at the edge of his vision and who was already moving toward the east corridor. The private room was a small lounge, leather chairs, a round table, the ambient hum of climate control. Charlotte was sitting in one of the chairs reading, not pretending to read. Actually reading, with the concentrated stillness of a child who reads because she needs to, rather than because she's been told to. Ethan was standing at the window, looking out at whatever view the lounge window offered, his hands loose at his sides. They both looked at him when he walked in. He stopped. He had thought about what they might look like. He had spent portions of the previous 10 days constructing a mental image from the photographs in Gerald's file. 2 children, 6 years and 10 months, twins. But photographs in the actual physical presence of 2 small people who share your jaw and your height, and something in their eyes that he recognized because he had seen it in his father's eyes and in his own eyes in mirrors for 41 years, were different things. Charlotte closed her book. Ethan turned from the window. Neither of them spoke first. Vincent sat down. He didn't do it because he felt that sitting was the appropriate action. He did it because his legs had made the decision independently. He sat in a chair across from them and looked at his children, and the thing in his chest that had been tightening for 10 days pulled to a specific point. Charlotte reached into a bag beside her chair and removed an envelope. She placed it on the table between them. "There are 7 photographs inside," she said. Her voice was clear and even and utterly without sentimentality. "1 for each year." He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up immediately. "You don't have to look at them now," Ethan said from beside the window, which was the first thing Ethan had said, and the voice was lower than Vincent expected, already carrying the register that Vincent's own voice had carried at 30. "But you should look at them eventually." "There's a last photograph," Charlotte said. "It's not a photograph of anything. It's a message." Vincent picked up the envelope. He opened it with the particular careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to control the pace at which he absorbs difficult information. Inside were 7 photographs. He went through them in order. Charlotte, at what appeared to be several weeks old, in a hospital blanket, in a room he did not recognize. Ethan at the same age, same setting. The two of them together at what looked like 6 months, on a blanket in sunlight. A birthday, first candle. A park. Both of them mid-run. Evelyn at the edge of the frame, not quite looking at the camera. A school performance of some kind. Charlotte in a costume, Ethan in the audience. A rooftop somewhere, both of them looking out at a city that was not New York. 7 photographs. 7 years. The final photograph was a sheet of white paper with a single typed line. We are not asking you to come back. We are asking you to admit we exist. The room was quiet. The climate control hummed. Vincent held the piece of paper in both hands and read the sentence twice, and then sat with it and did not perform anything. There was nothing to perform. He was in a room with his children, and his children were watching him, and the sentence on the paper was the most specific demand he had ever been given in his life. He started. Charlotte held up one hand briefly, and the gesture was so like her mother's that it stopped him completely. You don't have to say anything right now, she said. We're not asking for a response tonight. We're asking for one eventually, Ethan said. From the window, still watching him, Vincent put the paper down on the table. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at Ethan. He thought about all the rooms he had sat in across all the years of his professional life, and the weight he had carried into them, and the weight he had never acknowledged, and the particular architecture of fear that had built the entire structure of his adult choices, and he understood. Sitting in a small lounge off the east corridor of a midtown Manhattan hotel, with 2 children who watched him with the calm, patient precision of people who had been waiting a very long time for this moment, that he was not in a room he knew how to navigate. He was in a room he had to actually be in. Okay, he said. The word came out without the control he usually put on words, which meant it sounded like something he actually meant. Charlotte looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not much, not into warmth exactly, but into a kind of careful attention. Like a door that has not opened, but that has moved, fractionally, in the frame. There's one more thing, she said, and reached into the bag again. Vincent watched her hand. What she placed on the table this time was not a photograph. It was a formal invitation, the same cream cardstock as the gala invitations, but handwritten in a child's precise, self-taught lettering. An address in Manhattan, a time, a date, 2 days from now. Mom doesn't know we're giving you this, Ethan said. He finally moved away from the window and sat in the chair beside his sister. He looked at Vincent directly, and his face in that moment held something that was not a child's expression. It was older than 7. It was the face of someone who had thought about something for a long time and arrived at a conclusion. She's going to be angry. Probably, Charlotte said. There was a small, brief thing in the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile. Why are you giving it to me? Vincent said. Because she won't, Charlotte said, and someone has to. Vincent looked at the address on the card. He looked at his children. He held the card in one hand and the envelope with 7 photographs in the other, and the particular sound of everything that was coming toward him. The weight of the conversation he would need to have, the door he would need to stand in front of and knock on, the full accounting of 7 years that he could no longer ask anyone to carry except himself, was already here, in this room, waiting. He put both items in his jacket pocket and stood. I'll be there, he said. Neither of them responded. They watched him go. And in the quiet of the east corridor, walking back toward the ballroom where Evelyn was working the room with the competence of someone who had long since stopped waiting for anyone to rescue her, Vincent DeLuca was already trying to think of what he was going to say when he knocked on a door he had no right to be standing at, and coming up, for the first time in 41 years, completely empty. The drive back from the gala took 40 minutes in traffic that Vincent did not register. He sat in the back of the car with the partition up and the city sliding past the windows in long smears of light, and he did not look at his phone, and he did not call anyone. Miroslav drove. The car smelled like leather and the faint chemical trace of the interior cleaning product the detailing crew used every Thursday, and Vincent sat with his hands flat on his thighs and the envelope in his jacket pocket pressing against his chest with a weight that was not physical. He had 2 children. He had known this for 10 days in the abstract clinical sense of having read it in a file. He knew it now in the different, ungovernable sense of having sat across from them in a small room and watched them hand him 7 years of his own absence in a cream paper envelope. Charlotte's voice, clear and even, and entirely without the tremor that adults put into difficult conversations because adults have learned to perform their difficulty for each other. She had not performed anything. She had simply stated facts. The facts were that there were 7 photographs and 1 message, and the message was not a demand in any emotional sense. It was a minimum. The floor beneath which nothing could be built. Admit we exist. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose and held it there. The car pulled through the estate gates at 9:47. The main hall lights were on. He could see the glow through the tall windows flanking the entrance, and he sat in the car for a moment after Miroslav cut the engine and looked at the house. His house, the DeLuca estate, 4 generations of accumulated power and reputation and carefully managed image, and felt something he did not have a word for. Not guilt exactly, something older and less articulate. The sensation of standing outside a structure you built and realizing for the first time that it was designed entirely to keep things out, rather than to hold anything worth keeping in. He went inside. Victoria was in the parlor. She had not gone to bed. She was sitting in the same chair as the night before, which struck him as significant in a way he didn't examine, and she had a book open on her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" she said. "I met them," he said. The book closed. Not dramatically. She simply put her hand flat on it, and it closed. "Both of them?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something careful and controlled that he recognized, because it was the same thing his face did when he was managing a reaction that he hadn't decided what to do with yet. They were, in that way, very similar people, which had been useful for the functioning of their marriage, and was now, in this room, a kind of mutual exposure. "And," she said, "they're extraordinary," he said. The word came out before he'd filtered it, and he heard it land in the room between them and did not take it back. Victoria looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then she said, "What do they want?" "To be acknowledged," Vincent said. "That's it. That's all they said they wanted." "That's never all anyone wants." "These children," he said, and stopped. He sat down across from her, in his chair, the one that faced the window, and he said it again. "These children are not like anything I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, anger, something I could handle." Victoria made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "And instead, clarity," he said. "Complete, absolute clarity." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the envelope. He held it for a moment and then placed it on the side table without opening it again. "They gave me 7 photographs, 1 for each year." The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the drive. Victoria looked at the envelope on the side table and then looked at her husband, and the quality of her attention in that moment was the kind that strips the social coding off a situation and gets down to the material underneath. "Vincent," she said, "what are you going to do?" He looked at her. He thought about the address on the card that Charlotte had placed on the table with her precise, self-taught handwriting. He thought about what Ethan had said. "Mom doesn't know we're giving you this." He thought about the quality of the silence in the lounge when he'd said, "I'll be there," and neither of them had responded, had simply watched him go with the patient, evaluating attention of 2 people who had heard promises before and were not in the business of celebrating them in advance. "I'm going to go to the address they gave me," he said. Victoria nodded once. It was not an endorsement. It was the nod of a woman who has taken in information and has not yet decided what to do with it, and who has enough self-possession to know that deciding too quickly is its own kind of mistake. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should talk about what that means. For us." "I know," he said. "Not tonight," she said, "but soon." "Yes," he said. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than Vincent could say for most of the silences they had shared in recent years, and he filed that away somewhere that he would have to come back to. He did not sleep before 2 a.m. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at nothing useful for an hour, and then closed it and went to the window and stood there. The estate grounds were dark and still. The security lights made small pools at the perimeter. He had bought this house 8 years ago because it was the kind of house that communicated a specific thing about the person who owned it, and standing at the window at 1 in the morning, he could not remember what that thing was or why it had seemed important. At 1:15, he called his father. Marco DeLuca answered on the third ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he had been waiting. The old man had a particular quality of nocturnal attention that Vincent had noticed as a child and had never been able to explain, a readiness, as though sleep were something he maintained only a loose relationship with. "Vincent," Marco said. "I need to talk to you tomorrow," Vincent said. "In person." A pause. "About." Not on the phone. Another pause. Longer this time. Marco DeLuca was 70 years old and had spent 4 decades in rooms where the unspoken content of a conversation was more significant than anything that was actually said, and he heard what was in his son's voice now, and he was quiet with it for a moment. "Come in the morning," he said. "Before 10. "Yes," Vincent said, and ended the call. He stood at the window for another 20 minutes, and then went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about 7 photographs and a sentence on a white piece of paper, and did not sleep until the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained work of staying upright inside yourself, finally pulled him under. Marco DeLuca's home was a brownstone in the East 60s that he had owned for 32 years, and that smelled permanently of espresso and the cedar blocks his late wife had kept in every closet. He was in the kitchen when Vincent arrived at 8:40, moving between the counter and the stove with the deliberate efficiency of a man who has cooked for himself for long enough that he has refined it to the minimum necessary motion. He did not look up when Vincent came in. "Sit down," he said. Vincent sat at the kitchen table. It was the same table he had done homework at as a teenager, a heavy oak thing that had survived 4 moves and showed its history in the grain. Marco brought 2 cups of espresso, set one in front of his son, and sat across from him. He looked at Vincent. His eyes were dark and sharp, and had not changed in quality in the years since Vincent had last sat across from him in this kitchen. They were the same eyes that had built an empire and buried 2 business partners and made the decision, 25 years ago, to begin the slow, deliberate process of converting illegal income into legitimate holdings, a project that was 3/4 complete by now, and that Marco tracked with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things take longer than you want them to. "Tell me," Marco said. Vincent told him. He did it without editing and without the particular management of information that he applied to every other conversation in his life, because Marco DeLuca was the one person alive who would hear the management immediately and whose patience for it was precisely 0. He told him about the mural, about the gala, about the private lounge, and the 2 children and the envelope with 7 photographs and the card with the address. He told it in the order it had happened, without commentary, and when he finished, he picked up the espresso and drank it. Marco sat across from him and had not moved. The kitchen was quiet. The coffee maker on the counter had finished its cycle and was making the small ticking sound of cooling metal. 7 years, Marco said. "Yes." "She was pregnant when you divorced her." "She found out. I believe she found out after, but yes, she was pregnant." Marco put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I made you do that." It was not a question, and it was not phrased as an apology, and the fact that it was neither of those things made it more significant than either would have been. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who had spent his life arranging facts in whatever configuration was most useful, and who was, for what appeared to be the first time, arranging them in their actual configuration, regardless of how useful that was. "You presented the situation," Vincent said carefully. "Don't," Marco said. The word was flat and hard. "Don't manage this conversation with me, Vincent. I'm too old and I know you too well." Vincent set the cup down. "I pressured you to end your marriage," Marco said. "I told you the alliance with the Ashcroft family was necessary. I told you that Evelyn was not—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I said things about her that I had no right to say." "You said she wasn't family." "Yes." "You said she didn't understand what we were." "Yes." "You said the DeLuca name needed to be built forward, not sideways." Marco looked at him. "I said all of it, and you listened." "I chose to listen," Vincent said. The distinction mattered. He had been working out, in the sleepless hours since the gala, what belonged to his father and what belonged to himself, and he was not going to assign more of it than was honest. "You were afraid," Marco said. "I used that." The kitchen held both of them. A car alarm went off somewhere on the street outside and stopped after 4 cycles. "I have grandchildren," Marco said. The word came out of him with a weight that was not grief exactly and not joy exactly, and was something more complex than either, the specific weight of a man who has organized his entire life around the concept of legacy, realizing that the legacy he built had a hole in it that he put there himself. "Yes," Vincent said. "Their names. Charlotte and Ethan." He paused. "She named the boy Ethan Marco." Marco was quiet for a very long time. When he finally moved, it was to put one hand over his eyes for a moment, a gesture that Vincent had never seen his father make in 41 years, a gesture of a person momentarily overwhelmed by something they cannot manage away. And then he lowered it, and his face was composed again, but something had shifted underneath the composition, something permanent. "What do you need from me?" Marco said. "I need you to know they exist," Vincent said. "And I need to know that when I go to that address tomorrow, and I stand in front of Evelyn, and whatever she says to me, I'm not doing it because the family needs something from it. I'm doing it because they are my children, and I was not there, and I need to begin being someone who could stand in the same room as them without—" He stopped. Marco waited. "Without them being ashamed of what I am," Vincent finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Marco picked up his espresso, found it empty, and set it back down. He looked at his son with the sharp, dark eyes that had never once softened publicly in 70 years, and they were soft now, in the kitchen, at 8:50 in the morning, in a way that cost him something visible. "Then go," he said, "and don't come back until you've told her I know. Tell her I said—" He stopped again. Rearranged. "Tell her I said that I was wrong about all of it." Vincent nodded. He stood. He picked up the empty espresso cup and put it in the sink, which was something he had done as a teenager in this kitchen and which he did now without thinking. He put on his jacket. At the kitchen doorway he stopped. "She named him Marco," he said again. Not for information, for whatever it was. His father said nothing, but he did not look away. The address on Charlotte's card was a brownstone on West 73rd Street, 3 blocks from Central Park. It was a historic building, recently purchased according to Gerald's research, and it had that quality that certain old Manhattan buildings have, of looking as though they have been there long enough to have opinions about the people who come and go through their doors. The stone facade was clean. The window boxes had early spring plantings that someone had tended recently. The door was a deep, particular green. Vincent stood on the sidewalk in front of it for longer than was dignified. He was aware of this and did not correct it immediately. It was 10:47 a.m. on Saturday. He had not called ahead. He did not know if Evelyn knew he was coming. Charlotte had said she didn't know they'd given him the address, which did not mean she hadn't found out since, which meant the door might open to something he was not prepared for. He had run through the variables. The variables had told him nothing useful. He knocked. The door opened in 40 seconds. The woman who opened it was not Evelyn and was not Charlotte or Ethan. She was a woman in her 60s, small and brown-skinned, with white hair pulled back severely and eyes that took in Vincent with a single comprehensive look that communicated a quantity of information about what she thought of him that she did not put into words. He recognized her. It took him 3 seconds, but he got there. Maria Gonzalez, who had been the housekeeper at the apartment he and Evelyn had shared for the last 2 years of their marriage. He had never learned her last name at the time. He knew it now because it was in Gerald's file. She was on the foundation's domestic staff, had been since shortly after Evelyn established herself in New York, had apparently followed her there from the apartment in the particular loyal way of people whose loyalty is not to positions but to persons. Maria looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, in a tone that communicated absolutely nothing except the information content of the words, "She's in the kitchen." He stepped inside. The house was warm and smelled like coffee and something cooking and the faint trace of turpentine that he identified after a moment as coming from the direction of what appeared to be a studio space at the back of the ground floor, a large room visible through an open doorway, canvases stacked against the walls, a work table with paint supplies, organized with the particular neatness of someone who works in chaos and compensates in storage. Charlotte's space. He did not stop to look, but he registered it, filed it. He followed the sound and smell of the kitchen. Evelyn was at the stove. She had her back to the door and she was stirring something with the particular focused attention of a person who is aware that someone has entered the room and is choosing deliberately to finish what they are doing before turning around. She was wearing a dark sweater and her hair was loose, and she looked like a person in her own kitchen on a Saturday morning, which was the most ordinary possible thing and was, standing in the doorway, almost impossible to absorb. She turned around. Her face did the thing he'd noticed at the gala. It did not move in any particular direction. It simply was. She looked at him with an expression that was neither welcome nor warning, that was simply attention, and she said, "Maria told me you were at the door." "I should have called," he said. "Yes," she said. She turned the heat down on the stove and put the spoon on the rest beside it. She turned back to face him and crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was just arranging herself. "Charlotte gave you the address." "Yes." "She didn't tell me." "She said you'd be angry." Something moved in Evelyn's face, brief and not quite readable. "She was right," she said, "but it was not angry. It was something more complicated than angry. It was the face of a mother who has been outmaneuvered by her own children in the service of something she cannot entirely argue against." "I'm not here to—" Vincent started. "Don't tell me what you're not here for," she said. The words were flat and clear and not cruel. "Tell me what you are here for." He looked at her. The kitchen was between them, maybe 6 feet of it, with the stove and the counter and the smell of whatever she'd been cooking, and he thought about all the things he had prepared on the drive over and all the ways he had managed the language of difficult conversations in 41 years, and he put all of it down. "I'm here because 2 children who have every reason to not want anything to do with me arranged for me to be here," he said, "and because my father asked me to tell you that he knows, and that he was wrong." Evelyn was very still. "And because I spent 7 years telling myself I didn't know you were pregnant when I signed those papers," he said, "and I need to stop." The kitchen was quiet. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of footsteps, one of the twins, he thought, moving through a room, and then quiet again. "Were you going to tell me?" Evelyn said. Her voice had changed register, slightly lower. The particular register of a person who is past the management stage of a conversation and is in the actual terrain of it. "If you had known, were you going to tell me that you were filing and give me time to—" "No," he said. He said it before she finished the sentence because the honest answer was available, and he was not going to dress it up. "No, I was going to do exactly what I did. I was afraid of my father, and I was afraid of what I was, and I made a decision and I executed it, and I didn't let myself look at you while I did it, because looking at you would have made it impossible." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. The sound of the stove's low heat was the only sound in the kitchen. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you know," he said. "You knew then, that's why you didn't fight it." "I didn't fight it," she said, "because fighting it would have required me to stay inside it, and I was not going to stay inside something that had just shown me exactly what it was." He nodded. He had known this on some level for 7 years, the clarity with which she had signed the papers, the absence of screaming, of accusation, of the things he'd expected because he had expected her to fight him and had prepared for a fight and instead had been handed a silence that was more devastating than any fight could have been. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "I am not. I need you to understand something very specifically. I am not here for reconciliation. I am not here because I want something from you. I came back to New York because this is where my foundation's next phase of work is centered, and because my children wanted to be close to Central Park, and because I chose to. Not because of you. That is not going to change." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I'm not asking for reconciliation. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm asking to know my children." Evelyn looked at him. The particular look of a woman who has heard sentences like this before and who has a precise calibrated sense of what they mean in the moment and what they tend to mean over time, and who is in the process of running the assessment. "That," she said, "is not my decision alone." From the direction of the hallway, unhurried, came the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the stairs. Vincent turned. Charlotte and Ethan came into the kitchen together. Charlotte was holding a sketch pad. Ethan had bare feet and was carrying a glass of water. They both stopped when they saw him and looked at him with the same quality of calm, comprehensive attention that they had deployed in the hotel lounge. And then Charlotte looked at her mother and said, "We heard the door." "Yes," Evelyn said. "He came," Ethan said, not with surprise, with the particular tone of someone confirming a hypothesis. "He came," Evelyn said. Charlotte looked at Vincent. "You said you would," she said. "I said I would," he said. She nodded once, as though filing the data point. Then she opened her sketch pad and placed it on the kitchen table, face up. On the page was a pencil drawing, rough in the way that working sketches are rough, full of corrections and second lines, of a family at a table. 4 figures. One was clearly Evelyn, the line of her posture unmistakable. One was clearly Charlotte. One was clearly Ethan. The 4th figure was a shape, seated at the edge of the table, present in the frame, but without a face yet, just the outline of a person in the space where a person could be. Vincent looked at the drawing for a long time. "That's not finished," Charlotte said. "Obviously." He looked up at her. "Obviously," he said. The kitchen was full of morning light and the smell of whatever was on the stove, and the particular suspended quality of a moment that is not yet resolved, that is still in the process of becoming whatever it is going to be. And Vincent DeLuca stood at the edge of it, the edge of a table in a drawing, the edge of a kitchen in a brownstone in Manhattan, the edge of something he had spent 41 years building the wrong things to avoid. And he understood, with a completeness that he could not manage or redirect or file away, that there was no version of the next conversation that he could prepare for, because the next conversation was going to require him to be something he had never, in his entire adult life, been willing to be. Someone who stayed. And then the door opened behind him, and Maria walked back into the kitchen, and she looked at him with those comprehensive eyes, and she said, without any particular emphasis, "You never once asked my last name." And the sentence landed in the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be said, and Charlotte looked up from the sketch pad and looked at her mother, and Evelyn's face held something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. And Vincent stood in the kitchen of a brownstone on West 73rd Street, on a Saturday morning, and opened his mouth and closed it and understood that this specific, unglamorous, undramatic, utterly unignorable moment was Maria Gonzalez. The name had been in Gerald's file. It had been a data point. Domestic staff, foundation employee, formerly employed at the West Side apartment, relocated to Geneva with the foundation's household division 3 years after the divorce. Vincent had read it the way he read all data points, as information, not as a person. He looked at her now. Small woman, 60-something, white hair, eyes that had just said something to him in front of his children and his ex-wife that no one in his professional life would have dared to say, and she was standing at the kitchen counter with a dish towel in her hands and waiting with the patience of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment for a very long time. "Maria," he said. "Gonzalez." Maria looked at him. Her expression did not change. "I didn't ask," he said, "when you worked for us. I addressed you as Maria, and I didn't ask your last name, and I didn't ask anything else about you, and I should have." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn had gone still near the stove. Charlotte had her eyes on Vincent with the focused attention of someone watching a test being administered. Ethan drank from his glass of water and said nothing, which was Ethan's particular form of attention, the absence of distraction. Maria looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "No, you should not have had to be asked. You should have wanted to know." She folded the dish towel in half and placed it on the counter. "But yes, Gonzalez, my husband's name. He died in 2019. You also didn't know that." "No," Vincent said. "Mrs. Carter came to the funeral," Maria said. "She closed the Geneva office for 2 days so the staff could attend. She gave the eulogy." She picked up her coffee cup and looked at Evelyn briefly and then back at Vincent. "That is the kind of person she is. I want you to know that while you're standing in her kitchen deciding what you're going to say next." Vincent nodded. He did not defend himself against any of it because there was nothing to defend. The facts were the facts. Ethan set his water glass on the counter. "She also makes better coffee than anyone," he said, which was such a sudden and complete non sequitur that Charlotte made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh that had been in the room since Vincent arrived, and the tension in the kitchen shifted. Not broke, but moved into a slightly different configuration, one that had room in it for something other than reckoning. Evelyn looked at her son with an expression that managed to be simultaneously exasperated and deeply fond. "Go get dressed," she said. "Both of you." Charlotte picked up her sketch pad. She looked at Vincent on her way past. "We're going to the park later," she said, "if you want to come." She said it as a fact, not an invitation, neither pressuring nor withdrawing, just placing the information on the table the way she placed everything, cleanly, without decoration. "I'd like that," Vincent said. She nodded and left. Ethan followed, his bare feet silent on the floor. Maria took her coffee cup and went somewhere else in the house with the discreet efficiency of a woman who knows when a room needs to be smaller. Evelyn and Vincent were alone in the kitchen. She turned back to the stove and turned the heat up slightly and picked up the spoon. He watched her move through her own kitchen with the easy precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is, and he thought about how many mornings had gone into building that kind of ease in a space, and how none of those mornings had included him. "Sit down," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just the words. He sat at the kitchen table. The sketch pad was gone, but the drawing was in his mind. The four figures, the faceless shape at the edge of the frame. Evelyn brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with the direct, unmanaged attention that he had not been able to handle at 32 and that he was going to have to learn to handle now. "The children have conditions," she said. "Not demands. Conditions. There's a difference." "Tell me," he said. "They will tell you themselves. But I want you to hear the framework from me first, so that when they say it to you, you understand what it means." She paused, drank her coffee. "They are not asking you to become their father in the way you would have been if you had been there from the beginning. That person doesn't exist anymore. What they are asking is whether you can become someone who earns the right to be in their lives going forward. Those are completely different things." "I understand," he said. "You understand the sentence," she said. "You don't understand yet what it costs." She looked at him steadily. "It costs patience, consistency, showing up when it's inconvenient, accepting being wrong and not making the admission of it into a performance. It costs not disappearing when the situation becomes complicated." She paused again. "It costs becoming someone who is not afraid of the thing you are most afraid of." "Which is," he said. "Being seen," she said, "as you actually are, not as the DeLuca name, not as the empire, as the person inside it who has been hiding behind it for his entire adult life." The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee was good, dark and clean, the way he preferred it, which he noticed and filed without commenting on. "That," he said, "is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 20 years. "I know," she said. "I knew it when we were married. I watched you use the fear to make every major decision you made. I thought—" She stopped. She looked at her cup. "I thought you'd get there on your own eventually. I was wrong about the timeline." He said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. "The list," she said. "The children have a list. Charlotte wrote it. Ethan edited it. It's not punitive. It's practical." She stood, went to a drawer near the refrigerator, and came back with a folded piece of paper that she placed on the table in front of him. "Read it here. Don't take it with you." He unfolded it. Charlotte's precise handwriting, with small marginal notes in a different hand. Ethan's, he assumed, slightly more compressed. The list had 7 items. He read them slowly. The first, learn our mother's recipe for the soup she makes on Saturdays. Not from someone else. From her, if she's willing. From asking. The second, find out the full name of every person who has worked in your home for more than 1 year and use it. The third, tell your father that we exist and that you have seen us, not through a lawyer, you, directly, in person. The fourth, file for divorce if you haven't already. Not for us. Because your marriage is not honest and you know it. The fifth, apologize to the woman who helped our mother leave. Not a formal apology. A real one, face to face, that acknowledges specifically what she did and why she had to do it in secret. The sixth, let us meet your other son, when he's ready, on his terms, not yours. The seventh, stop making fear your primary decision-making tool. This one cannot be checked off. It has to be proven over time. He folded the paper. He looked at Evelyn. The fifth one, he said, the woman who helped you leave. That's Maria. Yes, Evelyn said. She was still working in the house when you left. She gave me 3 days' notice and left. You were in Chicago. Evelyn's voice was flat. She helped me pack what I needed. She called a car. She came with me to the airport. She didn't tell anyone where we were going. A pause. Your security team called her twice in the following week. She told them she didn't know anything. Vincent looked at this folded paper. He thought about that, about Maria, in the house he had come back to from Chicago to find cleared of Evelyn's things, telling his security team she didn't know anything, with full knowledge of exactly where Evelyn was. He thought about what that cost a 60-year-old woman employed by a man with the kind of reputation the DeLuca name carried. She was protecting you, he said. She was protecting all of us, Evelyn said. She is the reason I got out cleanly. He nodded. He put the folded paper back on the table where Evelyn picked it up and returned it to the drawer. I already told my father, he said. This morning. Evelyn looked at him. He said to tell you he was wrong, Vincent said. His words. Something happened in Evelyn's face. Something small and specific and deeply private, there and gone in less than 2 seconds. But he saw it because he was looking at her the way he should have been looking at her 10 years ago. Good, she said quietly. What? The park was cold in the particular way of early spring in New York, where the sun is present and completely ineffective against a wind that still carries the conviction of February. Charlotte walked beside Vincent with her sketch pad under her arm and pointed out things. A specific tree she liked the shape of, a dog whose gait she found interesting, the way the light was hitting the reservoir at that angle. She did not perform the pointing out. She simply said things as they occurred to her, which was the most natural mode of conversation and the one that, in Vincent's professional life, almost never happened. Ethan walked on Vincent's other side and asked questions. Not about the DeLuca empire. Nothing about business, nothing about power or money or reputation. He asked about the DeLuca family's history in New York, when Marco had arrived, what the city had looked like then, what it meant to build something in a place that was always changing. He asked these things with the genuine curiosity of someone who is filling in a history that belongs partly to him and that he has been given only half of. Vincent answered as honestly as he could, which included the parts that were not flattering, the methods his grandfather had used, the partnerships that had required a specific willingness to operate outside legality, the slow and ongoing process of legitimization that Marco had begun and that Vincent had inherited. He did not dress it up. Charlotte listened while she sketched things in her pad, not looking at him while he spoke, but not missing anything either. After 40 minutes, they stopped at a bench near the east path. Charlotte sat and opened her pad. Ethan stood looking at the water. Our grandfather, Ethan said. Marco, is he going to want to meet us? Yes, Vincent said. He already does. Is he like you? Charlotte said from the bench, pencil moving. Vincent considered this honestly. He's who I learned to be afraid from, he said, and who I learned to be capable from, both. Charlotte looked up from the pad. She studied him for a moment. That's a real answer, she said. I'm trying to give real answers, he said. She looked at him another moment, then back down at the pad. Okay, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth, not yet. It was something more preliminary and more important than either. It was the opening of an account. A ledger that had previously held only deficit being open to the possibility of entries in the other column. Vincent understood this because his father had taught him how accounts worked, and for the first time in his life, he understood that the most important accounts were not financial. His phone began going wrong at 4:17 p.m. He was in the car heading back to the estate from the park, the twins back in the brownstone with Evelyn, the afternoon having ended with a handshake from Ethan, formal, deliberate, the handshake of a child who has been taught that the gesture means something, and Charlotte handing him a torn page from her sketch pad with a drawing on it that he did not look at until he was in the car. And when he looked at it, he saw the 4 figures from the kitchen drawing again. But this time, the figure at the edge of the table had a face. It was not a precise rendering. She was 6 years old, and she had drawn it in 15 minutes on a park bench. But the face was there, and it was his. He was looking at it when the first call came in from Miroslav, and then the second, and then a third from Gerald, and the particular quality of 3 calls in 90 seconds told him before he answered any of them that something had broken. He called Gerald first. Talk, he said. Gerald's voice had the specific texture of a man trying to maintain his professional register while delivering information that wants to come out at a different volume. Someone leaked the gala, he said. The meeting, your presence there, the private room. Vincent said nothing. There are photographs, Gerald said, taken from outside the hotel, telephoto, of you entering and exiting. Someone cross-referenced your presence with the gala's foundation and ran the research. Vincent, it's going to major outlets. By this evening, it will be everywhere. What exactly do they have? Vincent said. They have you at the gala. They have your connection to Evelyn Carter, which they've reconstructed from the divorce records. Those were sealed, but the existence of the divorce isn't. They have a pause, a paper sound. Someone provided the outlet with information about the children, names, ages, the connection. The car felt smaller. Who? Vincent said. I don't know yet. The leak is too specific for it to be paparazzi work. Someone with access to information that isn't public provided it. Someone in my house, Vincent said. Silence on Gerald's end. Then, or someone with access to your house's information. Vincent thought about who had known. Miroslav, Gerald, Victoria. He thought about Victoria sitting in the parlor Friday evening with 3 fingers of scotch she didn't usually drink, asking him what he was going to do. He thought about the specific way she had said not tonight, but soon, when she meant they needed to talk about what his acknowledgement of the children meant for them. He thought about the fact that Victoria had a brother named James Ashcroft, who had been trying for 2 years to position himself as the primary force in the DeLuca-Ashcroft business relationship, and who had communicated in various ways over those 2 years that he considered Vincent's leadership of the DeLuca legitimate holdings insufficiently aligned with Ashcroft family interests, and who would benefit significantly from a public scandal that forced Vincent into a defensive position. Find out who, Vincent said, before tonight. I'm trying, before tonight, Gerald? He ended the call. He called Miroslav. The estate, he said, who was in and out yesterday and today, full log, cross-reference with every outgoing communication from household devices. Now. Already running, Miroslav said, which meant he had anticipated this by several hours, which was why Vincent paid him what he paid him. The car moved through traffic. Vincent looked at Charlotte's drawing in his hand and then placed it carefully in his jacket's inner pocket, where it would not be damaged. His phone rang again. Not Gerald, not Miroslav. Victoria. He answered. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice was different. The precise social register was gone from it entirely, which in 9 years of marriage had happened exactly twice, both times in situations of genuine crisis, and which told him before she said anything else that whatever was coming was going to require him to sit very still inside himself. Tell me, he said. James called me this morning, she said. He knew about the children. He knew about the gala. He knew you'd met them. A pause. He asked me to confirm the information. He said he had a contact at one of the outlets who needed a source. The traffic outside the car windows was very normal. People in other cars, buildings, the usual city. Victoria, he said, what did you tell him? The pause was 4 seconds. He counted them. I told him I didn't know anything, she said. I told him he had the wrong information and that he should let it go. Another pause, shorter. He didn't believe me. He said he was going to run it regardless. He said, her voice changed slightly. He said that an exposed DeLuca scandal would be useful for repositioning the Ashcroft network's public business relationships. He used those words. Useful. Repositioning. He used you, Vincent said. He tried to, she said. I didn't give him anything, Vincent. I want you to know that. Whatever is coming, I didn't give him the specifics. But he already had specifics. Yes, from someone else. Someone with access I don't have. She paused. He's been building this for a while. This wasn't a reaction to the gala. He knew about Evelyn before the gala. The car had stopped at a light. Vincent looked out the window at nothing. How long? He said. I don't know. Long enough to have the children's names. Her voice was quiet now, a specific kind of quiet. He had their names, Vincent. He told them to me to prove his source was reliable, Charlotte and Ethan. He said them like they were weapons. Vincent thought about two children in a park this afternoon, Ethan asking about the family's history, Charlotte drawing on a bench with her pad. He thought about what it meant for their names to be in an outlet by evening, for the story of their existence to become a media event in the hands of people with no stake in protecting them. He thought about Evelyn. "I have to call her," he said. "Yes," Victoria said. "You do?" A pause. "And Vincent? I'm sorry. I know what this is going to cost, all of it." He ended the call and immediately dialed Evelyn. She answered on the second ring, which told him she had already seen something. "I know," she said, before he said anything. Her voice was level in the specific way of someone who is managing something that wants very badly to not be managed. "Priya called me 20 minutes ago. They have a contact at the outlet. We have maybe 3 hours before it breaks." "I'm going to put out a statement," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Not a defensive one. Not a managed one." He was already thinking through the language. Not the lawyer language, not the PR language, the actual language of a person saying an actual thing. "I'm going to acknowledge them, directly and publicly, on my own terms, before the outlet does it for me." Silence on her end. Then, "That will change everything for you. Your business, the family's reputation, all of it." "Yes," he said. "Your father's empire," she said. "The legitimate holdings. There will be board members, partners, people who will use this to challenge your position." "Yes," he said again. "Vincent." Her voice had something in it that was not warmth, but was adjacent to it. The sound of a person who has been braced for a particular impact for a very long time and is recalibrating to the possibility that it might not land the way she expected. "Are you sure?" He looked out the car window. The city was doing what it always did, moving, without regard for anyone in it. He had spent 20 years trying to be the kind of man the city had to regard, and he understood sitting in the back of the car on a Saturday afternoon in early spring that the only thing he had ever wanted to be regarded by was in a brownstone on West 73rd Street and had handed him a drawing of a face. "Pull over," he said to Miroslav. The car pulled to the curb. Vincent got out. He stood on the sidewalk. He took out his phone and he called not Gerald, not Miroslav, not any of the apparatus of the DeLuca machine. He called the direct line of the journalist at the outlet who had been building the story, whose name he had from Gerald's earlier information. And when she answered, he said his name, and then he said, "I'm going to give you a statement. You will use it as written or not at all. Are you prepared to take it down?" She was prepared. He stood on the sidewalk in the middle of the city, and he said, in plain language, without lawyers present, and without his PR team, and without the carefully built architecture of managed disclosure that his entire professional life had been constructed to require, that Charlotte Evelyn Carter and Ethan Marco Carter were his children, that they were 6 years old, that they had been raised by their mother, Evelyn Carter, who had built a life of extraordinary quality entirely independently and entirely without his involvement, and that his absence from their lives for 7 years was his failure and not theirs, and that he intended to spend however long it took making himself worthy of a place in their lives, and that the DeLuca name and the DeLuca empire and the DeLuca reputation could absorb this truth or it could not, and either way, the truth was the truth, and it was his, and he was done managing it. He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk. His phone rang immediately. Gerald. He did not answer. It rang again. A board member. He did not answer. It rang a third time, and the number was one he recognized as belonging to James Ashcroft, and he looked at it for a moment and then sent it to voicemail with a particular deliberateness that felt, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, like the first clean decision he had made in 20 years. He called Evelyn. "It's done," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" He told her. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said very quietly, "You didn't have to do it that way." "I know," he said. "There were cleaner ways, legally cleaner, professionally. I know," he said. "I didn't want a clean way. I wanted the true way." Another silence, shorter. "The children are going to see this," she said. "Yes. Charlotte is going to want to know exactly what you said. She's going to want the precise words. I know. Ethan is going to ask you why you waited until there was a leak to do it." The question landed in him with the specific weight of a thing that is absolutely fair. He stood on the sidewalk with traffic going past and the city doing its indifferent thing around him, and he thought about what he was going to say to Ethan when Ethan asked that question. "Because I was afraid," he said to Evelyn, "and because I'm trying to stop making decisions from that place. And because I would rather have done it an hour earlier, in my own time, without the pressure of an outlet and a leak and James Ashcroft using my children's names as weapons. But that isn't what happened. What happened is what happened, and I'm not going to manage the story of it into something better than it was." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Come back to the brownstone." He was already walking. Behind him, on the phone that was still ringing in his jacket pocket, the DeLuca Empire was doing what empires do when their foundations shift without warning. It was making noise, sending signals, demanding response, pulling at every established line of loyalty and obligation with the full force of 20 years of accumulated structure. And Vincent DeLuca walked away from the car and toward West 73rd Street and did not look back, understanding with the specific and terrible clarity of a man who has just stepped off a ledge that there was no version of the next 72 hours that was not going to cost him something enormous, and that the only question left was whether what he was walking toward was worth. The story broke at 6:41 p.m. Vincent knew the exact time because he was sitting in the front room of the brownstone on West 73rd Street when Priya walked in from the hallway with her phone and placed it face up on the table in front of Evelyn without saying anything. And the timestamp on the article was 6:41. And the headline was large and unambiguous and used all three names, Vincent DeLuca, Evelyn Carter, and the Foundation, in the first sentence. The second sentence named the children. Evelyn read it. Her face did not move. She picked up the phone and read the full article and set it back down and looked at the window for a moment. And then she looked at Vincent, and what was in her face was not directed at him. It was the contained, functional anger of a person who has had her children's names put into the public domain without her consent, and who is now in the process of deciding very quickly what to do about it. "Charlotte and Ethan," she said to Priya. "Where?" "Upstairs, Charlotte's room. Maria is with them." "Keep them there for now." Priya left. Evelyn stood and went to the window. Vincent sat at the table and let her have the space without filling it, which was one of the things the list had said. Stop making fear your primary decision-making tool, and which in practice meant sitting still when his instinct was to manage and organize and direct. "Your statement ran alongside the article," she said. "They used it." "I know. You acknowledged them before the outlet could frame it. That was the intention." She turned from the window. "It's better," she said, "than the alternative." A pause. "It's still my children's faces and names in the press at 6 years old." "Yes," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then back at him. "No, that's not fair. You did what you could in the time available. I know that." His phone was vibrating on the table between them with a persistence that had not stopped since he'd made the call to the journalist. Board members. Family associates. 3 calls from a number he recognized as belonging to the DeLuca Group's chief communications officer. 2 from a number in Italy that was his father's brother, his uncle Gianni, who had never once in Vincent's memory called him with anything pleasant. He turned the phone face down. Evelyn watched him do it. "That's not going to stop the calls," she said. "I know. You have to deal with them." "I will," he said. "Not tonight." She looked at him for a moment with the specific attention that he was beginning to understand was her default mode. Not suspicious exactly, not warm exactly, but present in a way that most people were not. A quality of seeing that didn't miss things, and didn't pretend to miss them either. Then she said, "Go up and see them, before they hear it from somewhere else." He went up the stairs. Charlotte's room was at the end of the hall. He could tell because the door was open and he could see the corner of a canvas leaning against the far wall, and because Maria was sitting in the hallway outside it, in a wooden chair, with her arms folded and her expression closed in the particular way of a person who is standing guard. She looked at him when he came up the stairs. She did not move from the chair, but she did not stop him either. He knocked on the open door. Charlotte was sitting cross-legged on her bed with her sketch pad. Ethan was on the floor with his back against the bed frame, looking at something on a tablet that he turned face down when Vincent came in. They both looked at him. "You saw it," Charlotte said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Is that what you said?" she said. In your statement, did you say exactly what you meant to say? He sat down in the desk chair near the door, turning it to face them. Yes, he said. I said that your absence from my life for 7 years was my failure, not yours, not your mother's. Ethan picked up his tablet again and looked at the screen. Reading, Vincent realized. Reading the statement. His face was very still in the way of someone absorbing information carefully. You said the DeLuca name could absorb this, or it couldn't, Ethan said without looking up. And that either way, the truth was the truth. Yes. Ethan put the tablet down. He looked at Vincent with those eyes that were Marco DeLuca's eyes, that were Vincent's eyes. And in them was something that was not approval exactly, but was the beginning of something, the first molecule of a trust that had not existed this morning, and was not yet trust, but was the material that trust is built from. Okay? Ethan said. Charlotte looked at her brother, then at her father. They used our names, she said. In the article, not just your statement. I know, I couldn't prevent that. I know you couldn't, she said. She looked at her sketch pad. She was quiet for a moment. Are people going to come here? Probably press will find the address within a day or two. I'm going to arrange security for the building, with your mother's permission. She'll say it's not necessary, Ethan said. She'll be right that she doesn't need it, and wrong that it's not necessary, Vincent said. So I'll ask anyway, and we'll negotiate it. Something happened at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Brief and controlled and very nearly a smile. From downstairs, Evelyn called up. Vincent? Her voice was clear and carried no specific emotion, which, in his experience, meant the emotion was present and significant. He went back down. Marco DeLuca arrived at the brownstone at 8:15. Vincent had not called him. Marco had called Vincent at 7, gotten voicemail, called Gerald, gotten a location, and arrived in a car with his driver and without any of the usual apparatus of a DeLuca family visit. No advance team, no secondary security, nothing. Just Marco, 70 years old, in a dark overcoat, standing on the sidewalk outside the brownstone when Vincent opened the door and looked at him. They stood in the doorway for a moment. You should have called me, Marco said. I handled it, Vincent said. I know you handled it. I read the statement. Marco looked at him steadily. It was the right thing. I want you to know I think that. Even though it's going to create problems, I'll spend the next 6 months managing. I know, Vincent said. I'm sorry for the timeline. There wasn't... Don't apologize for the timeline. Apologize for the 7 years. Marco looked past his son into the brownstone. Is she here? Yes. I'd like to speak with her, if she's willing. Vincent turned and looked at Evelyn, who had come to the hallway and was standing there with her arms crossed, and her face in that specific configuration that was not hostile, but was not open either. The face of a woman who has decided to wait and see what a moment requires before deciding what to give it. Mr. DeLuca, she said. Her voice was level. Ms. Carter, Marco said. He stepped across the threshold without being invited further, which was the DeLuca default. And then he stopped just inside the doorway and did not push further, which was something Vincent had never seen his father do in a room he wanted to move through. He stopped. He looked at Evelyn. And then Marco DeLuca, who had in 40 years of building an empire, never said the following words to anyone in a context that did not involve a business negotiation, said them plainly and without performance in the front hallway of a brownstone he had never been in before. I owe you an apology. A specific one, not a general one. I pressured my son to end a marriage that he didn't want to end, and I used language about you that I had no right to use, and I made a decision about your value to this family that was not mine to make. I was wrong. I am telling you that directly because my son told me you deserved to hear it directly. The hallway was quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Sit down, Mr. DeLuca. Oh. At 9:07, while Marco and Evelyn were in the front room, a conversation that Vincent was not part of and had not been invited into, and which he understood was not his to be part of. His phone rang with a number he had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. James Ashcroft. He answered it. Vincent. James Ashcroft's voice was the voice of a man who had gone to the right schools and learned in those schools that confidence was a tone you maintained regardless of the content it was carrying. He was 43, 2 years older than Vincent, and he had spent those 2 extra years cultivating a kind of ambient authority, that worked well in certain rooms and that Vincent had always found, beneath the surface, hollow. I'm going to assume you know why I'm calling. I know exactly why you're calling, Vincent said. He was standing in the narrow hallway near the kitchen, his back to the wall, his voice low. And I want you to listen to what I'm about to say very carefully. I'd be happy to. I'm not done, Vincent said. The coldness in his own voice surprised him slightly. Not because he wasn't capable of it, but because it was coming from a different place than it usually did. Not performance. Not the managed menace of a DeLuca family representative. Something flatter and more real. You went to my wife with information about my children and you asked her to be your source. You used their names to prove your intel was reliable. Those are 6-year-old children. You used their names like they were cards in a hand. That's a significant mischaracterization of James. The name alone. Flat. I have been in rooms with genuinely dangerous people for 20 years. You're not a dangerous person. You're a man who moves money and makes calls and thinks information is the same thing as power. It isn't. So I'm going to tell you one time what happens next. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. You will remove yourself from any involvement in DeLuca Ashcroft business operations. You will do this quietly, and you will give the board a reason that has nothing to do with this situation. If you do not, I will spend whatever time and resources required making sure that every business relationship you currently hold becomes aware of the specific methods you use to build leverage. Are we clear? Motto. Silence on James's end. Long enough to be real. You're making a serious mistake, James said, and the confidence in his voice had thinned to the point where the structure underneath it was visible. Probably, Vincent said. I'm making a lot of them lately. The difference is, I'm making them out loud now. He ended the call. He stood in the hallway for a moment. His heart was going faster than he wanted it to. He pressed his back against the wall and breathed through it. 3 breaths, slow, the way Miroslav had taught him years ago for situations that required the hands to be steady. And then he pushed off the wall and went to find something useful to do with himself. At 9:45, the doorbell rang. Maria answered it. She came to find Vincent in the kitchen, where he had been making coffee because the kitchen was something to be in that was not the front room where Marco and Evelyn were talking, or the hallway where he had just threatened James Ashcroft. Maria looked at him and said, "There is a woman at the door. She says her name is Victoria." Vincent set down the coffee pot. He went to the front door. Victoria was standing on the brownstone steps in a coat he recognized, her hair slightly windblown, no assistant with her. She looked at him, and her face had that quality again, the stripped-back quality, the one without the social coating. "I know I shouldn't be here," she said. "Then why?" he said. "Because James called me again after you called him," she said. "And because whatever he's going to do next, you should know about it tonight and not tomorrow morning." She looked past him briefly into the brownstone and then back at his face. "And because I owe her something. I've owed her something for 9 years, and I don't know how to give it to her, but I know I should at least try." Vincent looked at her. In 9 years, he had not seen this specific version of his wife. Without the presentation, without the maintenance of the image of a woman who is never surprised by anything unpleasant. She was surprised. She was more than surprised. She was in the particular state of a person who has spent years inside a structure they knew was artificial and has just watched the structure come down and is finding, in the wreckage, that the air is different outside it than they expected. "What did James say?" Vincent said. "He's going to the DeLuca board," she said. "Not with the story. The story is out. That's done. He's going to the board with a proposal to use this as grounds to restructure the DeLuca group's leadership. He's been building a coalition for 18 months. He has 4 board members. He needs 2 more, and he thinks this gives him the leverage to get them." Vincent felt the information go through him the way physical things go through. Not abstract, not information-shaped, but with actual weight and temperature. "He's been planning this for 18 months, he said. "At least," Victoria said. "The story, Vincent, the story wasn't a reaction to you going to the gala. He knew about Evelyn's return to New York before the gala. He knew before I did. He's had someone inside your organization for months." The night air on the brownstone steps was cold, and neither of them was dressed for standing in it, and neither of them moved. "Who?" Vincent said. "I don't know," she said. I'm telling you what I know. He has someone. He has had someone for long enough to build a picture of your movements, your vulnerabilities, your... She paused. He knew about the children's names before the gala, Vincent. That's not paparazzi. That's someone who had access to sealed records. Gerald, Vincent thought, or someone inside Gerald's firm, or someone with access to the court system through channels that Gerald would have used. Come inside, he said. I don't think... Victoria. He looked at her steadily. Come inside. She came inside. He brought her to the kitchen, which was empty, and he told her to sit. And she sat. And he poured coffee. It was done by now, at least. And he placed a cup in front of her and one in front of himself, and he sat across from her and they looked at each other across a kitchen table in a house that was not theirs, in a situation that was not anything either of them had planned for, and he said, Tell me everything he said. All of it, in order. She told him. It took 20 minutes. He did not interrupt. He listened the way he had learned to listen in rooms where the information was the only thing standing between a good outcome and a very bad one, with the particular quality of attention that does not evaluate until the input is complete, that stores and sequences and waits. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, Why are you telling me this? Victoria wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She looked at it. Because he used me, she said. He called me, and he used my marriage and my position, and he used your children's names, and he thought I would... She stopped. He thought I would go along with it, because I always have. Because that is what I have done my entire life in my family. I have gone along with things because it was easier than not. She looked up from the cup. I'm tired of it. The kitchen was quiet. From down the hall came the sound of a door opening and voices. Marco and Evelyn moving from the front room, the conversation apparently concluded. Vincent heard his father's voice say something low and Evelyn's voice respond, and then footsteps. Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway. She stopped when she saw Victoria. The two women looked at each other. Victoria, who had spent 9 years as the wife of the man Evelyn had been before, and Evelyn, who had spent 9 years building everything she had without any of the architecture that Victoria had been given as a birthright. They looked at each other with the specific attention of two people who have been in each other's proximity for years through intermediaries and documentation and implication and are finally in the same room. Victoria stood up. She was 3 inches taller than Evelyn, and she stood in the particular way of someone who has been trained to use height and presentation as tools, and then she let that go, visibly, consciously let it go. And she said, I know I have no right to be here. I'm here because I have information your children's father needs tonight, and because... She stopped. I know that's not enough. I know there isn't enough. I just want you to know that I never... Another stop. Her jaw tightened. I'm going to stop. I don't have the right words, and I don't think words are the right instrument for this. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Do you want more coffee? Victoria blinked. The pot is full, Evelyn said. She was not warm, and she was not cold, and she was not performing graciousness. She was simply a woman in her own kitchen making a practical offer to another woman who was standing in it, and the simplicity of it was more devastating than anything more elaborate would have been. Yes, Victoria said. Thank you. Marco came to the kitchen doorway. He saw Victoria, and his face did something complex and rapid that resolved, in roughly 2 seconds, into the face of a 70-year-old man who has decided to accept a situation rather than direct it, which was not something Marco DeLuca had significant practice at. He said, I'll have coffee also, and came in and sat at the table. And so at 9:58 p.m. on a Saturday night, in the kitchen of a brownstone on West 73rd Street that Evelyn Carter had purchased because it was close to Central Park, and because her children wanted to be near trees, 4 people sat at a table that had not been designed for this particular gathering, and Evelyn poured coffee, and Maria appeared at the doorway and assessed the situation and disappeared again. And upstairs, 2 children who had set all of this in motion with a mural and 7 photographs and a handwritten list were asleep or not asleep in their rooms. And the thing that James Ashcroft had built over 18 months to dismantle the DeLuca empire was moving toward its next phase. And Vincent sat at the table with his father and his estranged wife and his ex-wife, and understood that the board meeting that James was organizing would happen within 72 hours, and that the 4 people currently in this kitchen were the complete universe of people he trusted with the information Victoria had just given him, and that what he did in the next 24 hours would determine not just the future of the DeLuca group, but whether the man he was trying to become was real or was just another version of the managed performance that had defined every previous decision of his adult life. He looked at his father. Marco looked back at him with those sharp, dark eyes and said, very quietly, so that only Vincent could hear, "What do you need?" And Vincent opened his mouth to answer, and his phone on the table lit up with a message from Miroslav. 3 words, no punctuation, the kind of message Miroslav sent only when something had already happened and could not be undone. And Vincent read the 3 words and felt the blood in his face go somewhere else entirely. Because the 3 words were, "found the source," and the name beneath them was the name of a person who had been inside the DeLuca operation for 11 years. A person Vincent had trusted with the kind of access that could only be given to someone trusted completely. A person whose name in this context meant that the damage was not limited to the board and the business and the public story, but went deeper than that, went into the infrastructure, into the sealed records, into the systems that protected not just the DeLuca empire, but the people connected to it, which included 2 children asleep upstairs in a brownstone who had their mother's last name and their grandfather's first name, and who had decided with 7 photographs and a piece of painted plaster to ask their father to admit they existed, never knowing that the act of asking would pull a thread that unraveled something this. The name on Miroslav's message was Richard Fenn. Vincent sat with his phone in his hand and the name on the screen in the kitchen, around him full of people drinking coffee and not looking at him. And he ran Richard Fenn through 11 years of accumulated memory the way you run a hand across a surface you know well, looking for the thing you missed. Richard Fenn, 51, brought into the DeLuca Group's legal and administrative division in the early reorganization years when Marco was converting the operation and needed people who understood both worlds, the old structure and the new one, and who could move between them without leaving fingerprints. Richard had been that. He had been reliable, discreet, present at the right meetings, and absent from the ones that required deniability. He had Gerald's access level on most sealed documents. He had system credentials that went back 9 years. He was the kind of person whose name in any organization appears on every important document and in no important conversation, and who is therefore the last person anyone thinks to look at when they are looking for a leak. Vincent put the phone face down on the table. Marco was watching him. He had been watching him since the phone lit up, with the specific peripheral attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading rooms. "Later," Vincent said, low. Not now. Not in front of everyone. Not until he had thought through what Richard Fenn's name meant for the board situation, and what it meant for the sealed records, and what it meant specifically for the children upstairs whose names had ended up in the hands of James Ashcroft through a chain that now had a clear origin point. Marco nodded once. Vincent looked at Victoria. She was holding her coffee cup and looking at the table, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has said everything she came to say and is now waiting to find out what it costs her. "The board meeting," he said to her. "When?" "James said Monday. He told me because he wanted me to know I had until Monday to decide which side I was on." Her voice was flat. "He expected me to choose the Ashcroft position. He always expects that." "But you're here," Vincent said. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. This woman he had married for the architecture of what she represented and had lived alongside for 9 years in a house that had never quite been a home, and who was sitting in another woman's kitchen on a Saturday night, having crossed a line that her family was not going to forgive easily or quickly. She had not done it for him. He understood that. She had done it because she was tired of the things she had always been inside her family, and because James Ashcroft had made the mistake of underestimating the amount of self-possession required to stay inside a calculated marriage for 9 years without losing yourself entirely. "I'll need you Monday," he said. "At the board meeting, as a witness to what James said to you, both conversations." Victoria looked up. "That will end my relationship with my family." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do it. I'm telling you I'll need it if you're willing." She looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." Evelyn, who had been standing near the counter through all of this with the quiet attention she applied to everything, said nothing. She was not part of this decision and did not make herself part of it, which was the version of respect available in a situation this complicated. Chuck. He left the brownstone at 11:45. Marco left 10 minutes before him, his driver taking him back to the East 60s with instructions from Vincent to expect a call before 7 a.m. Victoria left separately, and he did not watch her go, and the things that needed to be said between them about the marriage and the divorce and the specific arrangements required to dissolve 9 years of shared structure were not said tonight, because tonight was not that night. He called Miroslav from the car. "Richard Fenn," he said. "Tell me how far." Miroslav's voice was careful and complete in the way it was when he had prepared for a conversation. Access to sealed court documents through a third-party legal database the firm subscribes to. He used his credentials but ran the queries through a secondary account registered under a shell entity. The shell entity was established 14 months ago. A pause. He copied files to an external server 11 times over 14 months. The files include the divorce records, the sealed financial settlement, and 3 communications between you and Gerald that were routed through the firm's secure system. "The children's information," Vincent said. "How did he get the names and ages from sealed records?" "The birth certificates were filed in New York. They're sealed but accessible through certain court system credentials. Richard had a contact in the clerk's office. We're still running that thread." Vincent looked out the car window. "Has he communicated with Ashcroft directly?" 11 verified communications over the past 8 months, most encrypted. The final one was 48 hours before the gala. 48 hours before the gala. Before Vincent had even confirmed his attendance. Someone had told James Ashcroft that Vincent was going to that gala before Vincent had fully decided to go. "He flagged my RSVP," Vincent said. "Yes," Miroslav said. "He had access to your personal calendar through the firm's shared scheduling system." The car moved through the empty late-night streets. Vincent thought about Richard Fenn. The unremarkable face, the careful professional demeanor, 11 years of showing up on time and doing the work, and being the kind of person you stopped noticing because they never gave you a reason to look at them. He thought about what it took to maintain that for 14 months, the patience of it, the sustained, deliberate daily choice to betray someone who trusted you, across 14 months of ordinary Tuesdays. He thought, briefly and specifically, about the mural on his entrance hall wall, about Charlotte and Ethan, 6 years old, planning and executing a security breach with months of patient research, driven by the absolute clarity of children who wanted one simple thing and were willing to do the work to get it. He thought about the contrast, what patience looks like when it comes from love, and what it looks like when it comes from something else. "Miroslav," he said, "I need Richard in a room Monday morning, before the board meeting. Not a hostile room, just a room where we can talk, without attorneys, without anyone else." "You want to give him the option," Miroslav said. It was not a question. He had worked for Vincent long enough to understand the architecture of what Vincent was describing. "I want to know why," Vincent said, "before I decide what happens next." "That's a risk." "Yes," Vincent said. "I know, Sam." Sunday was quiet, in the particular way that days before significant things are quiet. The quiet of an intake of breath, held. Vincent went to the brownstone at 10 in the morning. He had called ahead this time. Evelyn opened the door herself. The children were in the kitchen with Maria, Sunday pancakes apparently a standing event. The kitchen smelling like butter, and the specific domestic certainty of a household with routines. Vincent sat at the table and Ethan pushed the syrup toward him without looking up from whatever he was reading, which was the most natural gesture that had passed between them and which Vincent understood was significant precisely because it was not. After breakfast, Charlotte asked if she could show him the studio space. He said yes. The studio was the back room of the ground floor, the one he had glimpsed on Saturday with canvases stacked against walls. In full light, it was something else, not a child's art space in the sense he would have expected. Not easels with paintings of horses and primary-colored sky. The canvases were large and the work on them was serious, technically beyond what 6-year-old hands had any business producing, and the subject matter was specific and recurring: spaces, rooms, architectural interiors rendered in charcoal and thin paint wash, always with one element that was wrong or absent: a door that opened onto nothing, a window with no exterior, a chair at a table that had no other chairs. The missing thing, present in its absence. He stood in front of one of the larger canvases for a long time. You've been painting the same thing, he said. Different versions of the same thing, Charlotte said. She was standing beside him with her arms folded in a way that was unconsciously her mother's posture. Ethan says I'm obsessive. Mom says I'm focused. What do you say? She looked at the canvas. I say I paint what's there until it isn't anymore. She paused. I started that one 3 months ago. I don't think I need to finish it. He looked at her. The chair, she said. She pointed to the empty chair in the canvas, the one at the edge of the painted table, alone. I was going to leave it empty. I don't think I need to now. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was a thing to say that would be better than the silence. Monday morning arrived with the specific quality of mornings that have been building for a while. The air tighter than it should be, the light too ordinary for the weight of what it was illuminating. Richard Fenn came into the room at 8:15. The room was a conference space in the DeLuca Group's Midtown office, neutral and windowless. And Vincent was already there when Richard walked in, sitting at the center of the table rather than the head of it, jacket off, sleeves not rolled up. The deliberate signals of a conversation rather than an interrogation. Richard was 51, and he looked 51. And he looked, when he saw Vincent, like a man who had known for some time that this morning was coming and had spent the intervening time making a specific kind of peace with it. He sat down. They looked at each other. How long did you know I knew? Vincent said. Since Saturday night, Richard said. Miroslav's team pulled the secondary account at about 9 p.m. I knew when it went quiet. But you came in. Yes. Why? Richard put his hands flat on the table. They were steady, which told Vincent that the peace Richard had made with this was real and not performed. Because you asked me to come in, and because I've been in this situation for 14 months and I'm tired of it. Tell me why, Vincent said. Richard looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, My daughter has a condition. Chronic, degenerative, manageable with the right treatment, and not manageable without it. 3 years ago, the treatment protocol changed, and the new protocol costs 4 times what the old one did. The DeLuca Group's health coverage has a cap that was written 12 years ago and was not updated. I applied twice to have the cap reviewed. Both times it was reviewed and maintained. The room was very quiet. Ashcroft's people approached me 14 months ago, Richard said. They knew about my daughter. They had done their research. They offered to cover her treatment costs in full through a medical trust in exchange for information access. He looked up at Vincent. I said no the first time, but not the second. No, not the second. He did not look away. She had an acute episode 8 days after the second approach. I said yes the day after. Vincent sat with this. He ran it through the 41 years of his understanding of how people make choices, and where this particular choice sat on the map of choices he had judged, and choices he understood, and choices he had himself made from a position of fear. And what he arrived at was not simple. You should have come to me, he said. Would you have listened? Richard said. Not with bitterness, with the genuine question of a man who has spent 14 months with a particular calculation and is now checking the math. Vincent thought about who he had been 14 months ago. The managed image. The DeLuca apparatus, full operational, every decision filtered through the lens of what it cost and what it protected. A man who had divorced a pregnant woman because he was afraid of his father. I don't know, he said honestly. Richard nodded. He had apparently expected that answer. Your daughter, Vincent said. What's her name? Richard looked at him. Something in his face shifted. Not much, but specifically. Elena, he said. How old? 19. Vincent looked at this table for a moment. Then he looked at Richard. The health coverage cap, he said. I'm going to have it reviewed today. Not for Elena specifically, for every employee and dependent in the organization. It should have been updated 3 years ago. That's a failure of the organization, and I'm going to correct it. Richard did not move. That doesn't change what you did, Vincent said. You gave sealed information about my children to a man who used it as a weapon. That is not something I can pretend is a smaller thing than it is. I know, Richard said. You're going to need to provide Miroslav with a complete accounting of every file you accessed and every communication you had with Ashcroft's people. Everything. In writing. Today. Yes. And you're going to be present at the board meeting this afternoon as a witness. What Ashcroft did and how he built it, the board needs to hear it from the person who was inside it. Richard looked at him. That exposes everything about my role.
Yes, Vincent said. It does. You can refuse, and I will use what Miroslav has compiled instead, which will also expose your role, or you can come in and tell it in your own words, which is a different thing. He paused. It's not a good option. It's just a less bad one. Richard looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Elena's going to find out. Yes, Vincent said. She probably will. She's going to have to know her father is the person who... Richard, Vincent's voice was not unkind. She's also going to know her father spent 14 months making an impossible choice to keep her alive. Those things are both true. She's going to have to hold both of them. He paused. Most people end up having to hold two things about their parents that don't fit together. The kids who handle it best are the ones whose parents don't pretend the harder thing isn't there. Richard looked at him. I'm learning that, Vincent said. Currently.
The board meeting lasted 4 hours. James Ashcroft arrived at 2 p.m. with 2 attorneys in the confidence of a man who had spent 18 months building toward a specific outcome and considered it largely achieved. He walked into the boardroom and saw Vincent at the head of the table and Marco to Vincent's right, and Victoria 3 seats down, and Richard Fenn at the far end, and the configuration took him approximately 4 seconds to read. And in those 4 seconds, the confidence restructured itself into something more careful and more watchful. Vincent let him sit. Let him arrange his attorneys. Let him settle. Then he said, James, we're going to do this differently than you planned. What followed was not a confrontation in the cinematic sense. No raised voices in the first hour, no dramatic reversals. It was methodical and thorough, and it was the kind of meeting that people who have spent their lives in rooms where information is power recognize as the moment when one person's information turns out to be complete and another person's turns out to have gaps. Victoria provided her account of both conversations with James with specificity and without emotion, in the voice of a woman who has made her decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. Richard provided the complete documented chain of James's approach, the communications, the structure of the arrangement, the specific files accessed and transmitted. Marco sat beside his son and said almost nothing, and the quality of his silence was the quality of a man who built an empire and knows exactly how much weight a silence can carry. James's attorneys intervened 3 times in the first 2 hours. Each intervention cost James something. They were the interventions of people managing damage, not people preventing it, and the difference was visible to everyone in the room. At 4:47 p.m., James Ashcroft withdrew his proposal. He did it without conceding the language, which was the move of someone trying to preserve exit options. But the 4 board members who had been committed to him had been sitting in the room for 4 hours watching the architecture of his plan laid open from the inside, and 3 of them had already recalibrated, and everyone understood what had happened. James left without looking at his sister. Victoria looked at the door he had closed behind him for a moment. Then she looked at the table, and she straightened the pen in front of her with one careful finger, and she did not say anything, and Vincent watched her do it and understood what it cost, and he did not fill the space with anything because it did not need to be filled. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in November, 8 months after the board meeting. It was handled without litigation, without public spectacle, the terms negotiated by 2 attorneys over 6 weeks. Victoria received what was fair and kept the apartment on Park Avenue that had always felt more hers than the estate. Vincent sold the estate in December. Too large, too much history of the wrong kind, too many gilded frames for a life he was no longer living. He moved to a building 14 blocks from the brownstone on West 73rd Street. He did not move closer than that without being asked. He was not asked for another 3 months, and then Ethan asked if Vincent could pick them up from school on Thursdays, because Thursday was the day Evelyn had a standing foundation meeting that sometimes ran late, and because Ethan had decided, with the methodical reasoning he applied to most things, that this was a practical arrangement that also served a secondary purpose, which he stated plainly and without embarrassment. He wanted to see if Vincent would show up every week. Not some weeks. Every week. Vincent showed up every week for the rest of the school year, and the following year, and the year after that. There was one Thursday he missed because of a flight delay in London, and he called from the airport, and Ethan answered the phone and listened to the explanation and said, "Okay." And the following Thursday was normal, and the Thursday after that was normal, and the weight of consistent presence accumulated the way all real things accumulate. Slowly, without announcement, changing the landscape so gradually that one day you look up and the landscape is simply different, and you cannot point to the moment it changed. Marco met Charlotte and Ethan for the first time in October, 6 weeks after the board meeting, in the kitchen of the brownstone because Charlotte had said she wanted to meet him somewhere that smelled like food. Maria had made coffee. Marco had arrived without his driver for the second time in his adult life, carrying nothing except himself. And he had sat at the kitchen table and looked at his grandchildren with the eyes that were Vincent's eyes, that were Ethan's eyes. And Charlotte had studied his face for a long moment and then taken out her sketch pad and begun drawing him. And Marco had sat very still and let her. And the look on his face while she drew him was the look of a man receiving something he did not believe he deserved and accepting it anyway. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By the third Sunday, he knew where the coffee cups were. Met. Charlotte finished the painting in February, the one from the studio, the interior, the table, the chair that had been empty. She had worked on it through the fall in the hours after school and on weekend mornings before the rest of the house was awake. And when she was done, she told no one for 3 days, and then on a Saturday morning she brought Vincent into the studio and turned the canvas to face him. The room in the painting was still the same room, the same architectural structure, the same quality of light. The table was the same, but the chair was no longer empty. The figure in it was impressionistic, undetailed in the way she worked, built from suggestion rather than precision. The shape of a person present, sitting at a table, belonging to the composition without being its center. Around him the room had changed slightly in color, warmer in the upper registers, as though whatever light source illuminated the space had shifted. Vincent looked at it for a long time. "I didn't make you the center," Charlotte said. She was standing beside him with her arms folded. "I don't think that's right yet." "No," he said. "It isn't." "But you're in it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." She looked at the painting with the critical attention of a person assessing work. "It's not done either," she said. "I don't think it'll be done for a while. But I didn't want to keep it turned away." He nodded. "Can I leave it facing out?" she said. It was the first time she had phrased something as a direct question to him, rather than a statement of fact, and the distinction was not lost on either of them. "It's your studio," he said. "I'm asking what you think." He looked at the painting. He looked at the figure in the chair. Incomplete, suggested present. He thought about the mural in the entrance hall of an estate he no longer owned, the words that had begun everything, "Mother never forgot." He thought about what it meant for a child to hold a paintbrush long enough to say something that words couldn't hold. "Leave it facing out," he said. "It should be seen." She nodded once. She picked up her pencil from the work table. "Okay," she said, and she went back to work. And he stood in the doorway of her studio for another moment and then went to the kitchen where Ethan was asking Maria something about the history of a word he'd found in a book. And Maria was answering with the authority of someone who has lived long enough to have opinions about words, and from somewhere in the house the smell of coffee and the sound of a weekend morning assembled itself around him like something he had not earned and was being given anyway. He did not stand at the center of it. He stood at the edge, where the light was ordinary and the air was warm, and the company of people who had decided, for their own reasons and at considerable cost, to let him be present was the closest thing to a true account of himself that he had ever been inside. He picked up a coffee cup. He sat at the table. Ethan looked up from his book and looked at him with those dark, careful eyes, and then looked back down without saying anything, which was Ethan's version of welcome in which Vincent had learned to read correctly. And the Saturday morning continued around him, unhurried and unperformed and entirely real. And outside the window the city did its ordinary thing, and inside the kitchen on West 73rd Street, a man who had spent his life building walls sat at a table that was not his and drank coffee that someone else had made and understood, without needing to say it to anyone, that the greatest distance he had ever traveled was the 14 blocks between his building and this door. Walked every week, chosen every time, earned not once but continuously, the way all things worth having are. He was in the room. He was not its center. He was not its history. He was, for the first time in 41 years, simply present. And it was enough. And it was everything. And it was where he intended to stay.